Hello and welcome to Mythic Mind, where we pursue wisdom on the paths between primary and secondary worlds. I'm Dr. Andrew Snyder, and I'm glad that you're here. Hey there, welcome back. Today we're going to be continuing our Lewis study with Out of the Silent Planet. We're going to talk some more medieval cosmology and background, and we're also going to obviously get into the story itself. And so we'll be providing a broad overview. If you've never read this book, Out of the Silent Planet, you've never read the Ransom series, I very, very strongly recommend it. I feel like it's really been gaining a broad-scale popularity lately, especially in Lewis and in adjacent circles, and for good reason. And there's so many important things that are happening. Hold on. Let me turn down. I'm on a baby sound machine duty here. Let me turn that down. All right. So there's just so much in these books that is very applicable to our world today. It's Lewis just did a great job of dealing with things that were happening in his own age that have only widened out as they've moved downstream to the current era. Not that Lewis was really that long ago, all things considered, right? He's a fairly modern writer, but at the same time, like he's writing about things that are only beginning to develop to the extent that they have today. And more of that will become evident as we go through this series. We'll be getting to that. But before we do so, I do want to give just a quick plug for the other Mythic Mind things we have going on here. Over on the Mythic Mind Movies and Shows podcast, we're continuing with the Star Wars series. We just recently wrapped up the original trilogy with Return of the Jedi. So head over to the Mythic Mind Movies and Shows podcast to catch up on that and to get ready for the prequels that are coming up. And then over on Mythic Mind Games, we just began a two-parter on The Legend of Zelda. And so already you can find our kind of broad level conversation about Zelda. And then next week we'll have the second part of that, which is an interview with an expert on the subject. And that episode is actually already available on Patreon. And so you can check that out right now. Speaking of which, if you like what we do at Mythic Mind and you would like to get all episodes of everything that we're doing delivered into one podcast feed early and ad-free, become a patron at any level over at patreon.com/mythicmind. Of course, higher levels of support will provide you with more benefits, more content, but even just $5 a month provides you with all Mythic Mind episodes across the 3 podcasts, one feed and ad-free. And so you can head over to patreon.com/mythicmind. But for now, let's go ahead and jump to it with Out of the Silent Planet. Hello and welcome back as we get ready for Out of the Silent Planet. Like I said before, my goal in this is not to do a chapter-by-chapter deep dive analysis. We simply don't have the time to do that. But what I'm instead going to do is I'm going to focus on some key developments in the story to really give you this sense of theme, this sense of mood, to equip you with some tools for getting more out of the story yourself. And then I'm particularly going to save some of the really deep philosophical conversations in the story for our live meetings. And so don't think I'm skipping over that entirely. I do have some plans for that. But before we even get to Out of the Silent Planet, I want to actually do a little bit more build-up. I cut short a little bit previously when I was going over medieval cosmology, kind of the old view of the cosmos. And that's because I didn't want to give you too much of a map to what Lewis is doing. I didn't want for you to say, oh, the Eldila fit nicely into this medieval category. Oyarsa fits nicely into this category. No, I wanted there to be some mystery there. I wanted for you to explore some things on your own if you are reading this for the first time. But now that you've been through that, I do want to give you some of those categories so we can talk about what these strange beings are and kind of how they fit within the bigger picture. And so let's return to medieval cosmology and go a little bit deeper there. All right, so looking again at the medieval view of the cosmos, I really like this image here. And so we have the earth here at the center, and then we have the elements, which we'll talk about, moving out to fire here, this reddish orangish circle, because fire, of course, is the lightest, most ethereal of the elements. And so once you move past that, well, now we get the planetary spheres, starting with the moon and then moving outward. And eventually you get to the edge here, which then approaches the realm of God, where we have God ruling and reigning, and we have the entire cosmos moving in an ordered spherical motion in imitation of the perfect, fully actualized goodness of God. And so we have a very structured, a very orderly view of the cosmos. We really get this sense when you look at the medieval philosophers, the medieval theologians, that there is this unending goodness, that there is this luminosity in the very fibers of being, that existence is fundamentally good and ordered and purposeful, in reflection of the good order and the true purpose, the true end of all things, which is God. And so we get what I wouldn't necessarily call optimism, but a philosophy of absolute hope, that no matter how chaotic things seem to be, well, this earth, where things tend to break down, where things do tend toward corruption, where things do turn to disorder, we have the sense that this is just one small little point in a much bigger story. And the more that we identify with this grand story, this grand spiral, this great dance, as C.S. Lewis calls it in Mere Christianity and elsewhere, the more that we participate in the joy of the heavens, the more that we find that existence itself is deeply, fundamentally, and eternally significant and purposeful. And so there is this great joy to be found here. And I think in particular of Boethius, who I mentioned before, when he is falsely accused, he is imprisoned, he is awaiting what would be his death, he's able to find hope and joy and peace and fulfillment simply in resting in the perfect order that ultimately comes down from God. And so there's a lot of purpose, a lot of joy here. I may have mentioned this in one of the previous videos, but in the discarded image, C.S. Lewis talks about the difference between a modern and a medieval man when they go out and look up at the sky. And so maybe you've even experienced this, where you go out on a starry night and you look up in the sky and you feel the sense of maybe dread, maybe anxiety. You just feel insignificant. Lewis says that the modern man looks up at the vastness of space and he finds a question mark. He finds a lack of certainty. Well, the medieval man looks up at the heavens and he doesn't see a question mark. What he sees is an answer. He sees an answer to the fundamental questions that we're prone to ask. He finds a place for his mind to rest in the perfect order and joy that exists in the heavens. And so these are two fundamentally different ways of looking at the cosmos. It's not just a matter of different science. The science Lewis actually brings up is actually secondary to the primary issue. And the primary issue is the questions that we're asking, which are then connected to what we're seeking. And I guess the question is, well, what is it that we're seeking? Are we seeking order and purpose that actually exist, or are we seeking to project order and purpose on the cosmos? And these are two very different ways of seeing the world, and this is going to result in two very different worlds to be seen. And so let's break down the medieval cosmos a little bit more. All right, so at the center here, you have Earth. And if you were to go even deeper here to the center of the Earth, well, this is where you have hell, which is, of course, the furthest away from God, the furthest away from the realm of order, the realm of being, the realm of existence. And of course, if you're familiar with Dante's Inferno, once you get to the inner circle of hell, which would be the inner circle of the inner circle, well, at this point, everything is frozen. It's not moving. And that's because we are the furthest away from being itself. We're actually starting to approach non-being. But one thing that's very interesting is that in this understanding, God is usually understood as being stable. because he's fully actualized. If you're fully actualized, that means there's nothing else that you can actually do. There's nothing else that you can become. And so God is unmoving. Or perhaps we might want to say his actions are eternal, which is another way of saying the same thing. And so on one hand, you have God has complete stability, but also so does hell. And that's because the closer you get to evil, the more that you recognize evil is a pale imitation. It's a mockery of the good. And so just as God is stable, well, so is hell, but for very different reasons. But nonetheless, so you have hell at the very center, and then you have earth, which is the heaviest of the elements. On top of the earth, you have water. So now we're moving toward the lighter, toward the more ethereal. And so water is kind of the next sphere of earth, and then you move out a step further, and now you have air, and then move out further, and now you have fire in something like what we might call our atmosphere. But this is a pure fire, and because it's so pure, we don't see it. It's actually transparent. And so this is definitely a very Platonic idea here. And so we can definitely see Plato's influence here, that as we move toward the more real, we get less solid. The sense that there is this levity toward reality. And so the more that we move toward what is more real, things become lighter, more ethereal, less earth-bound. The more that we move away from the perfect order of the heavens, the more that we move away from the grounded being, well, the more grounded we become, the heavier we become, the more prone we are to being dragged down rather than rising up toward the heaven. And once we move beyond the last of these earthly spheres, well, now we move into the planetary spheres, which were believed to be moved along by divine powers. Now, of course, all of these powers are going to be named after Roman gods. But, I mean, of course, our medieval Christian philosophers and theologians don't believe in the Roman gods, at least in the same way that the Romans did. But even though the names kind of stick, they're really talking about angelic powers, angelic intelligences that are responsible for moving the planets in their spherical motion. And each of these angelic powers was said to have some particular influence, very often connected to what the god stood for in the Roman mythology. Now, Lewis points out that this might raise some questions for us, right? What are these medieval Christians doing with Roman gods and goddesses in their theology, in their cosmology? And Lewis says that, as far as he can tell, that really just wasn't an issue, which seems to indicate that the medievals believed that, the ancient pagans had something right, even though obviously they were wrong in a very fundamental sense. And we'll get more into the intersection of Christian theology and pagan mythology, especially when we get to Perelandra. And we can certainly talk about that more if you want to now in the Discord chat and in the live meeting, but he starts to deal with that more directly in Perelandra, and so that's where we will start to deal with it in these videos. But for now, just know that there seemed to be some recognition that the ancient pagans, even though they were wrong on a fundamental level, they weren't entirely wrong, that they had these certain desires and these certain thoughts that in some way at least start to approach reality, which are then given proper context within the Christian theological framework. And so when we talk about Luna, we talk about Mars, we talk about Venus, we're going to get some thematic associations with these pagan gods and goddesses, but really what we're talking about are Christian angelic intelligences, Christian angelic powers that are responsible for moving the spheres and exert some influence on our life down here on Earth. However, because the Earth is a fallen planet, because things tend toward corruption down here, well, a lot of times these influences will be misappropriated, even though operating as they are in the perfectly ordered realm of the heavens, they are all good, right? All of the planetary spheres have good influences. However, these influences can have a negative instantiation as they enter into our corrupted atmosphere and are picked up by corrupted men and women. All right, now the first planetary influence that we're going to talk about is the moon, or Luna. And a lot of the information I'm going to go over in this section of the video comes from C.S. Lewis's The Discarded Image, as well as Michael Ward's Planet Narnia. And this is a book that I probably should have recommended in the last video, because even though it's called Planet Narnia and deals a lot with Narnia, a lot of the information that he goes over also does relate to the Ransom series. And so I will be talking about this from time to time, but I'll probably talk about it a bit more of extended fashion when we get to Narnia. But anyways, so in the medieval model, Luna was the planet closest to Earth. In Greek and Roman myth, Luna was associated with a number of different named goddesses, such as Selene, Artemis, and Cynthia. And these goddesses survived into medieval and Renaissance times. Another of Luna's names was Diana, who was specifically the goddess of hunting, because of course when the moon is bright, well, now it's easier to hunt at night. And Luna's whiteness and brightness also made it natural to associate her with the metal silver. And so Luna produces silver in the earth. Now, because the moon has effects on the tides of the seas and the rivers, she became associated with wateriness. And on a related note, she's connected with inconstancy and doubt, with movement, with transitions. Above Luna's sphere, everything in the heavens was considered perfect and unchanging. But within and beneath Luna's sphere, everything was subject to alteration. And so this is where the order of the heavens starts to break down. And this kind of makes sense when you stop and think about it. The moon changes appearance on a regular basis. However, it changes its appearance in an orderly way that we can actually predict. You look up at the moon and, it has craters. It has some apparent physical imperfections. The moon has a light side and it has a dark side. And more mythologically speaking, the moon has one face toward Earth and the other is toward the order of the heavens. And so the moon is this transition point between order and chaos. For this reason, Luna had an influence on wanderers and travelers, those who were given over to movement. And she also has an influence over sanity, which is why people who lose their wits are called lunatics. And in fact, this is also connected to the myths of werewolves, right? Because Luna has an influence over sanity, a negative influence with Luna can actually lead people, in extreme cases, toward over-identification with their bestial, chaotic natures to the detriment of their reason, of their rational souls. And the only thing that can stop a werewolf is, of course, silver. And so we get really this beautiful poetic imagery in these myths that the only way that Luna can atone for her sins is with her tears, that is, with the silver that she produces in the earth. And so there are a lot of stories that are connected with the moon, and all this really comes down to some connection with transition toward life on the borders of realities. Luna gets a day of the week, which is, of course, Monday or Moon Day. Her metal is silver, as I mentioned, and she's associated with envy, with wateriness, with confusion, lunacy, boundary between certainty and mutability, and she's also a sponsor of hunting and wandering. Right. Next, moving out, the second planet closest to Earth in this model is Mercury. Now, Mercury was known to be the fastest moving of the planets. Partly because of this rapidity, Mercury became thought of as a messenger of the gods. He's often depicted with wings on his cap and on his heels. He held a wand with which he directed pious souls to their happy dwellings in the afterlife. And Mercury's lightness and quickness carry over to the metal with which he was associated. And so if you imagine Quicksilver, it's going to roll around a dish, dividing into droplets and then recombining very swiftly and glitteringly. And so this tendency of Mercury to divide and to reunite means that he became connected with a variety of different things that split up and then come back together. He is the god of boxers, of thieves, and even of crossroads. This, again, we get this idea of movement, of transition. In Greek mythology, Mercury is of course called Hermes, and as the messenger of the gods, Mercury was also thought to have a particular responsibility for speech. He was linked with scholarship and with learning. Now, his day of the week is Wednesday, by means of his Norse counterpart Woden. His metal is, of course, Quicksilver, and he is associated with swiftness, with heraldry, with skill in speech, and learning, ability to divide and to recombine, and he also is connected with the idea of twins, which will come up again when we get to the horse and his boy much later on. Now, moving out, next we have Venus. Now, Venus appears brightly in the sky both at dawn and at dusk and was known as the morning star, as well as the evening star, or Hesperus. Now, mythologically, Hesperus was a deity who had a western garden in which his daughters, the Hesperides, guarded a grove of immortality-giving apple trees. Now, we're going to see this imagery come up a couple times, obviously in Perelandra, as well as in The Magician's Nephew. Now, although Hesperus was conceived of as a male god, the special beauty of Venus in the sky led it to be thought of chiefly as a feminine planet. And of course, this is connected to Venus, the goddess of amorousness and sexuality. Since she presided over such qualities, she was also connected with fertility and creativity, and thence to motherliness. Now, Homer associated Aphrodite, or Venus, with laughter. She was the goddess of sweetness and love. She was considered one of the most positive influences, and so she was known as Fortuna Minor. Her day of the week is Friday by means of her Norse counterpart Frigga. Her metal is copper, and she is associated with sweetness, with warmth, with beauty, laughter, motherliness, sexuality, fertility, vitality, and creativity. And so she is a life-giving influence. She is a loving, she is a motherly, she is a feminine influence. In many ways, she is something like the feminine ideal. All right, moving out, next we have Sol, or the sun. Now, Sol was the eye and the mind of the whole universe. His sphere was the heaven of theologians and philosophers, and he produced the noblest metal, that is gold. And alchemists were always trying to harness his power, right? They were looking for the philosopher's stone that would allow them to turn base metal into gold. Sol's characteristic influence was to illuminate the human mind, making people wise and liberal. Obviously not in like a contemporary political sense, but in the sense of being generous, free, and opposed to greed and to raw pragmatism or utilitarianism. Sol burns away base considerations of greed and profit. And so here we have the influence that gives us gold. The influence that gives us wealth is also the influence that leads us to hold wealth in an open hand, to recognize that the metal, that the material of gold is nothing more than a symbol for that which is true wealth. And if we look to gold as true wealth, then we are grasping at shadows rather than the substance to which the shadow should point us if we're looking directly. And where we need to look is in the direction of the sun. However, the sun itself is nothing that our reason can grasp entirely. The sun is not something that we see, it's that by which we see. And so the more that we're able to see, not necessarily the sun itself, but we're able to see the world illuminated by the sun, well, the more rightly related we are becoming to the influence of Sol. Now, the Greek equivalent of Sol was Apollo. His position in the middle of the planetary ranks was held to denote a special dignity and honor, like the positioning of the heart in the middle of the body, or like a king dwelling among his subjects. And of course, in the Bible, the sun is frequently a metaphor for the divine image. And so, we tend to say that this old model is geocentric by placing the Earth at the center, but really, if you look at the way the heavenly spheres are arranged, it actually does have the sun at the kind of center of the planetary spheres. And so, in a manner of speaking, this could still be described as heliocentric. We just mean something a little bit different than that. And so we have this idea that reason or wisdom is found at the center of the influences, and it is by this reason that we're able to see everything else. Now, Sunday is obviously given the day Sunday. It's connected with the metal gold, as well as with wisdom, liberality, freedom, riches, enlightenment, and opposition to greed. Right. Next, we have Mars. Now, Mars is known as Infortuna Minor, and that's because it very often had an unfortunate influence. Not that the influence itself is bad. Remember, all of these heavenly influences are good. However, the influence of Mars is one that is perhaps more likely to be misappropriated. Of course, you all probably know this, that Mars is associated with war. He is the martial influence. And this martial influence, taken the wrong way, makes warriors into cruel and lawless men. However, taken aright, it fortifies noble knights in justifiable conflicts and gives resolve to martyrs suffering persecution, making them as strong as iron. Mars enables hard but necessary tasks to be accomplished. And I'll say more on this later, but if you've already read That Hideous Strength, consider one of our main characters, Mark, most certainly named after Mars. Now, Mars brings discipline, order, rhythm, and freedom from anxiety. In an earlier mythological tradition, Mars was a vegetation deity associated with the burgeoning of trees, woods, and forests. And of course, the springtime month of March is named after Mars. In this capacity, he was known as Mars Silvanus. And so now that you've read Out of the Silent Planet, consider the vegetation, all of the trees and plant life and whatnot that we see on the planet of Mars. And this is associated with this older tradition where Mars is associated with springtime realities. Now, Mars is given the day Tuesday by means of his Norse equivalent Tyr. His metal is iron, which kind of makes sense given the coloration. He's associated with vegetative growth in the month of March, particularly, with military strength and knightly discipline, as well as with courage and orderliness. Or, misappropriated, he's associated with cruelty and lawlessness. All right, moving out, we have Jupiter. Now, Jupiter was known as Fortuna Major. He was seen as potentially the best influence. He was the sovereign of the seven heavens. His kingliness was that of a king at peace, at leisure. He was enthroned. He was serene. The jovial influence, which another name for Jupiter, is Jove. And so the jovial influence made people cheerful and festive, yet also tranquil and magnanimous. Jupiter was thought to be a temperate planet, positioned as he was between the hotness of Mars and the coldness of Saturn. In a 10th century Arabic manual of astrology makes Jupiter the ruler of Western countries, and for that reason, he was seen as the patron of the Christians. And sometimes he was actually associated with Christ himself, which I think this might not be a medieval framework, but I think in light of what we know about Jupiter with the unending storm here, we even have the sense that he has a wounded side, which I think adds to the Christological imagery here in the planet of Jupiter. Jupiter represented joy, and particularly the pleasure and heart ease which come in late spring and early summer, when all the vestiges of winter have finally vanished. And so he is jovial, but this is a joviality that was hard won. Jupiter is connected with Thursday by means of Thor, with the metal tin, and the qualities of kingliness, with festivity and festal joy, as well as with tragic splendor and summertime tranquility. Now, our last planetary influence is Saturn. Saturn was known as Infortunum Major. He was seen as the most unfortunate influence in the way that it's usually received on Earth. He was the planet whose influence could most easily go bad. It was liable to cause sickness, old age, ugliness, disaster, melancholy, and death. If received aright, however, this influence might bring about godly sorrow, penitential wisdom, and contemplative insight. The mythological character of Father Time is very much based on the early pictures of Saturn, who was conflated with the Greek titan Kronos. And so Saturn is connected with the tendency of things to wear down and to fall apart. He's associated with the metal lead because of its heaviness and its dull gray color. He is, of course, connected with the day Saturday, and he's associated with pestilence, treachery, disaster, and death, or with godly sorrow, penitence, and deep penitential contemplation. And as you move beyond the planetary influences, you then move to the stellatum, which is the realm of the fixed, unmoving stars, go out to the outer rim beyond that, and now we have the prima mobile. This is the first sphere of the physical cosmos. This is the first thing that moves. And this outer rim of the cosmos moves in imitation of the unmoving goodness, the absolute stability and order of God. And so as this first sphere moves, it then moves the sphere below it and all the other spheres under it until finally we get to Earth, where this movement starts to lose its order, where things start to fall apart. And, in the Platonic and in the kind of Neoplatonic model, this is because there's something inherently corruptible about Earth. But as we move into the Christian medieval model, that idea is not entirely gone altogether. However, what really makes Earth given over to corruption is the fact that we live in a fallen planet. right? We, unlike the planets out here, we have fallen into sin. We have turned away from God. We have turned away from that which brings order. And in so doing, have fallen into disorder, have fallen into chaos. And this is why we are the silent planet. We do not participate in the music of the spheres, in the music produced by the intelligences out here that move and sing in direction of the glory and goodness of God. And so we are a silent planet. We've left that angelic choir. Now, next we talk a little bit about angels. And we already have a little bit in that we know that angels are moving the planetary spheres, but the role of angels really played a significant part of the medieval understanding of the cosmos. And so the cosmos is inhabited by ranks of angels, which are outlined by the Neoplatonic early medieval mystic Pseudo-Dionysius. Now, Pseudo-Dionysius says that there are 3 different hierarchies of angels, and each of those hierarchies are inhabited by 3 different classes of angels. And so first we have in the upper hierarchy the seraphim, the cherubim, and thrones. And most of this information is going to come from the discarded image. But we find that the first hierarchy of angels faces God with nothing between, encircling him with their ceaseless dance, and they communicate to each other of the beauty and the glory and the wisdom of God. Each seraphim passes this knowledge to the one next to it, until this transformative knowledge is passed to the next order, and then finally to the next hierarchy. And so the seraphim are all facing God, but they're all communicating what they see to each other, to other angels. And then the seraphim, in turn, pass this knowledge on to the cherubim, and the cherubim, in turn, pass this knowledge on to the thrones. And so we see that knowledge begins ultimately with God, and then derivatively, it begins with the seraphim, who then pass it to each other, and then that knowledge passes its way down to the thrones, which then pass that knowledge down to the dominations, and then to the powers, and then to the virtues. And so, as with this first hierarchy, this second hierarchy faces God with back toward us, and continues this great dance that begins with God's glory. Now, it should be noted here that we don't see God doing a great deal. And I've already mentioned this, and that's likely connected to Aristotle's notion that God, being fully actualized, is stable, and he moves the cosmos not by performing actions, but as a beloved moves a lover. This model is very much alive in the Neoplatonic tradition that Pseudo-Dionysius is drawing from. Now, the lowest hierarchy is concerned with the affairs of man, and principalities are the guardians and patrons of nations, and archangels and angels appear to human individuals, passing on the knowledge that they receive through the angelic chain that reaches back to the very presence of God. And they invite humans to participate in this great celestial dance. And now, this might get a little bit confusing here, because all of these beings are described as angels, but also angels is used in a technical sense for really the lowest order of angels, and these are the ones that are most likely to be involved in human affairs, because the others are too busy just contemplating the goodness of God and talking about the goodness of God. And of course, what this lowest rank of angels is doing is still good, and they're fulfilling their purpose, but that purpose is, it's more earthly, right? It's further away from the inner circle of God. And the medievals believed that the heavens were home to countless angels. There's no such thing as empty space in the medieval cosmos. In our modern understanding, we tend to think that the universe is primarily empty, overwhelmingly empty, right? This is why we even use that word space, as opposed to the older word of the heavens. And so while we are tempted to feel alone in the cosmos, if anything, the medieval might feel a little claustrophobic, because everything is inhabited. And so there are countless numbers of angels up in the heavens, doing their angelic things, glorying in God, passing on this knowledge, moving the spheres in imitation of the goodness and stability of God. However, in the medieval cosmos, angels were not typically the only rational species that exists aside from humans, because also, of course, we have the fairies, or as Lewis refers to them, the longevi. Now, what are fairies? Well, these are creatures that really live on the borderline of understanding. There are a few different theories regarding what angels are that we see played out in the medieval and Renaissance writings. And so one possibility is that they are a third rational species distinct from angels and men. Perhaps these are the daemons of old that the Greeks talked about, these things that inhabit the air. And maybe we might say that there's something between angels and men in that they might have bodies, if that's the right word, something similar to angels, even though they have minds that perhaps are more like the minds of men. Right? And a lot of times these fairies are associated with nature, and so maybe there are some, spirits of the water, there are spirits of the forest, there are spirits of the earth, that there are these spirits that are at play in the natural workings of the world. And for this particular study, I'm not necessarily interested in delving into the actual reality of fairies, even though I think that's a conversation worth having. And those of you who follow me know that's something that's of interest to me. But I will say that within the broad Christian tradition, regarding Christian thought as well as regarding scripture, I don't see any reason to say that this first point is at all impossible. Right? I mean, there are a lot of things that we're simply not told in Scripture. There are a lot of things that orthodoxy just doesn't need to take a firm stance on. And so, does this mean that, that some kind of creature like this exists? No, not necessarily, but it also doesn't mean they necessarily don't. And so that's just a little food for thought. Maybe we can talk about that more if you want to. But another possibility is that these are demoted angels of some kind. And so perhaps these are angels that were sympathetic to Lucifer, and they are banished to earth until they receive their ultimate condemnation on doomsday. Or perhaps these are angels that remain neutral during Lucifer's rebellion, and maybe they have the possibility of redemption one day. This was a common theory. Or perhaps these are undead spirits of some kind. And a lot of the fairy stories deal with something related to the undead. And then lastly, we have this view that what we call fairies, are really just devils, that they are fallen angels. And this is the view that really picked up, especially in late Renaissance, picked up especially with the Puritans. And Lewis actually believes that the reason why the idea of fairies as such really fell out of discourse is because of this view. And so it's not so much that science dispelled the fairies, but he actually believed that their identification with devils is what got rid of the idea of fairies as such. And for what it's worth, Lewis believes that that is not a good thing. Now, why does this medieval model of the cosmos matter? Because in a certain sense, we know that it's not true, at least in the way that we usually use the word truth. Now, Lewis addresses this in the end, kind of an epilogue of The Discarded Image. Right? He spends his entire book talking about the beauty and the glory and the order of the system, but then he brings up the question, well, okay, what do we actually do with this? And a lot of what I'm about to read actually just comes straight from The Discarded Image. Lewis writes, "But the change of models did not involve astronomy alone. It involved also, in biology, the change, arguably more important, from a de-evolutionary to an evolutionary scheme, from a cosmology in which it was axiomatic that all perfect things precede all imperfect things, to one in which it is axiomatic that the starting point is always lower than that which is developed. And the degree of change can be gauged by the fact that primitive is now in most contexts a pejorative term. This revolution was certainly not brought about by the discovery of new facts." And it goes on a little bit later. "But nature gives most of her evidence in answer to the questions that we ask her." Let me repeat that. "But nature gives most of her evidence in answer to the questions that we ask her. Hence, as in the courts, the character of the evidence depends on the shape of the examination, and a good cross-examiner can do wonders. He will not indeed elicit falsehoods from an honest witness, but in relation to the total truth in the witness's mind, the structure of the examination is like a stencil. It determines how much of that total truth will appear, and what pattern it will suggest." And so in other words, there are a number of presuppositions that go into the questions that we ask of nature. And the questions that we ask of nature will largely determine the answers that we receive. And so, is the medieval view of the cosmos right, or is it wrong? Well, that very much depends on the questions that we're asking. And the questions that the modern man asks tend to be very different than the questions that the medieval man would ask. And so, I mean, I don't necessarily suggest that we need to, in a physical sense, return to a pre-Copernican cosmos, right? And Lewis is very clear about that as well. He is not suggesting that we scrap our modern astronomy books and go back to a pre-Copernican understanding of the physical cosmos. However, just because we're sort of rearranging the physical layout of the cosmos actually doesn't say anything to the more metaphysical reality at play in the medieval worldview. And this metaphysical reality is, of course, what Lewis would have us hold on to. It is this metaphysical view of the cosmos that we see very much playing out in the Ransom trilogy, or the Ransom series, as well as beyond, and arguably in Narnia especially as well. And we'll talk about that more once we get there. And so there is a big overview of the medieval view of the cosmos. I think that's going to give us some useful concepts, useful themes to work with as we talk about Out of the Silent Planet, and as we go beyond that to Paralandra, that hideous strength, and then even beyond that. But for now, I'm going to take a brief little break, and then we'll actually get to Out of the Silent Planet. Welcome back. So that break was a little bit longer than I intended, for me at least. It's now a different day, and my light bulb burned out, so I had to open the shades in the background, and so I do apologize that from time to time you're going to see the sun pouring forth from the background. But, I mean, in light of everything that we just talked about, maybe we can come up with some kind of cosmological significance of that. But regardless, let's go ahead and finally get started on Out of the Silent Planet. And we're going to start by looking at the introduction, kind of the setup for the story in the first couple of chapters. It's a way of setting the mood and looking at some of the themes that hopefully will awaken something in the reading that you've already done. As we find out from the Fox Until We Have Faces much later on, we see that even the past is not settled because, as we're told, the divine nature can even change the past. And so let's go ahead and see what happens. Right at the very beginning, in the initial scene, we're told a violent yellow sunset was pouring through a rift in the clouds to westward, but straight ahead over the hills, the sky was the color of dark slate. Every tree and blade of grass was dripping, and the road shone like a river. Now, one thing that I think is worth considering here, even aside from the specific imagery that's coming through in these sentences, is just the vivid, very sensual, very sense-experiential language that we get throughout Lewis's writing. His descriptive almost just kind of drips off the pages. It's meant to kind of overwhelm you, or perhaps a better way of saying that is meant to beckon you. It's meant to call you into something fluid, something moving, because you yourself are supposed to be moved through the narrative. Lewis tends to write what in literary language would be called a romance. And I don't mean like a cheesy romantic novel. What I mean by romance is this is something that's supposed to, call you forth on a grand existential journey. That there's a mystical quality here. It's meant to not just be this adventure story where, this happens, this happens, this happens, and you have all these, thrilling plot twists, even though, we get that here and there. Fundamentally, what we don't get are thrilling plot twists. Really what we get are perhaps twists in our understanding of reality, our understanding of the world, more so than simply our understanding of the thrilling narrative. And so this language here is very sensual. It's meant to evoke a mood. It's meant to bring us into something. And I think that this really speaks to Lewis's medievalist sympathies, where wisdom is really about orienting yourself toward the good and about consuming the good. It's about being consumed by the good. It's about losing yourself in light of what goodness is, what reality most fundamentally is. And it's when we lose ourselves to the right thing in the right way that we actually come to find ourselves. And so this is why Lewis is going to use this very almost overwhelming sense language throughout his descriptive prose. There's this poetic nature to everything that he writes. But anyways, to the specific imagery here, we're told that, it's cloudy, right? There's this, the sky itself is the color of dark slate, but the sun is piercing through this dark slate ceiling. And so we get the sense that that the earth that Ransom is currently inhabiting is closed off to the heavens above, right? It has almost a ceiling to it. And so it is self-contained. It is not looking out to the heavens. However, we're told not that his vision went up to the sunset, but we're told that the yellow sunset was pouring through a rift in the clouds. And so we see from the very beginning that the sun, the heavens, are piercing the roof of this world. And that really does set the theme for what's going to happen in this entire series, right? It's all about Earth being exposed to the heavens, that this void in the cosmos is going to be brought to terms with what it is meant to be. It's going to be brought back into conversation with the heavens, for better or for worse, depending on who you are and where it is that you're standing. Okay, so Sol is shining its rays through the rift in this terrestrial ceiling, and it's illuminating the grass, it's illuminating the road, it's causing the road itself to shine, perhaps even to shine like gold which is produced by Sol in the medieval cosmological framework. And so he's walking on this path of gold. He's being led upward back to Sol, back to the place of reason, and ultimately back to the heavens, where we are meant to have fellowship with this angelic reality that happens in the cosmos. And so there's a lot that's contained in this rather mundane initial setup of this scene. Now, also in the introduction, we get a few, I think, rather clear, rather intentional connections to Dante. And so let's talk about Dante a little bit, who did have some special significance for Lewis. Christina Hale says that Dante's poetry encapsulates everything that Lewis loved about the medieval cosmos: the light and life, the bursting vivacity and creativity, and the rich tapestry of ideas and images, emotions and languages that the medieval model presents. And I should say that Dante captured Lewis's imagination a good while before his conversion to Christianity. See, a lot of times people think that Lewis had a Christian message, and then fantasy, myth, provided a good vehicle for conveying that Christian message, and that's why he wrote fantastical stories. And this is especially said of Narnia. However, this is actually not right. In many ways, it's the reverse of the reality, because mythology, stories, both pagan and Christian, captured Lewis's imagination very early on and stayed with them, became an important, formative part of who he was and how he thought and how he desired. And so Lewis didn't choose this genre to convey Christian truth. It actually is his love of myth that is largely responsible for leading him to Christianity. Right? It was in his conversation with Tolkien when he realized that perhaps there's actually some reality to the things that he's always loved. And to get more on this, I recommend that you read Lewis's essay, Myth Became Fact, in which he talks about the fact that, all the things that he loves in great mythology, even great pagan mythology, ultimately speaks to something real, to the myth that became fact in Jesus Christ. And so, for many ways, voices like Dante served as pre-evangelism for Lewis. They gave him familiarity with certain ideas that became more real with his conversion. Okay, so let's look at some thematic connections here. And so, first looking at Dante, we're told at the beginning of the Divine Comedy, "Midway along the journey of our life, I woke to find myself in a dark wood, for I had wandered off the straight path." And so here we have a middle-aged wanderer, right, the pilgrim, going through a dark wood, not on the path he originally set off on. Now let's look over at Out of the Silent Planet. "The last drops of the thunder shower had hardly ceased falling when the pedestrian," and so notice we're not even giving his name right now, right? He's called the pedestrian, much like Dante's pilgrim. "The pedestrian stuffed his map into his pocket, settled his pack more comfortably on his tired shoulders, and stepped out from the shelter of a large chestnut tree into the middle of the road. He was tall, but a little round-shouldered, about 35 to 40 years of age. In fact, he was a philologist and a fellow of a Cambridge college." And so, Dante gives us a middle-aged pilgrim poet. Lewis gives us a middle-aged philologist pedestrian. And so I think that there is some very intentional parallelism happening here. Next, another example, Dante says, "I raised my head and saw the hilltop shawled in morning rays of light sent from the planet, that leads men straight ahead on every road. Now over to Lewis. He had walked thus for a matter of 2 miles when he became aware of a light ahead. He was close under the hills by now, and it was nearly dark, so that he still cherished hopes of a substantial farmhouse until he was quite close to the real origin of the light, which proved to be a very small cottage of ugly 19th century brick. And so again, thematic connection here, some parallelism in language. We get that just as Dante, Lewis sees a light over the hill. Now, Dante tells us that the light that he saw was the morning rays of light sent from the planet that leads men straight ahead on every road. And so here we get a kind of divine providence shining forth, and that's the light that Dante's following. Now, Lewis here, and this is, I think, really interesting, Lewis's light is actually the light coming from the cottage. And so this is not a heavenly light, at least not most directly. But I think what Lewis is doing here is that he's not just saying, okay, I'm writing a story that's going to parallel Dante's Divine Comedy. No, what he's doing is he's kind of riffing off of Dante, and he's doing it in what I think is a really sophisticated way. And so on one hand, this seems to be a very mundane light coming from the cottage. However, in light of Dante, what Lewis is telling us is that this mundane light is actually a reflection, or it is something that's participating in the heavenly light of providence. And so this is going to be a major theme throughout the Ransom series. The idea that really, there is no such thing as the mundane. That even though the earth in some ways is closed off from the heavens, it is still part of the heavens. It is still playing a role in the big story, even if it's not necessarily doing so intentionally. And so even mundane things participate in supernatural realities. And so Lewis is going to continually break down the barriers that we tend to create between the terrestrial and the celestial, between the natural, the supernatural, the mundane and the spectacular. And this is something he very often does, right? Where Lewis will break down these borders and help us to recognize the glory in what we normally think of as inglorious common things. And so this is one way that Lewis is going to work to re-enchant our vision and help us to recognize the fantastical in everything around us. And so this is, on one hand, it's the light of a small cottage, but it's much more than that. Ultimately, it is the light of providence piercing the shadows. It is the light of the sun piercing the rift in the clouds, shining into this dark world. And so there are a number of things that are happening at play here. Now, however, I think that we need to be careful here. I've seen that some people will look at these early connections to Dante and then use the Divine Comedy as some kind of map for understanding Out of the Silent Planet as a whole, or even the entire Ransom series. For example, in Deeper Heaven, Christina Hale is going to try to say that Out of the Silent Planet gives us hell, Paralandra gives us purgatory, and That Hideous Strength gives us heaven. And I mean, there are some ways to do that, but I just don't think that naturally works. I don't think that Lewis is trying to give us the Divine Comedy reworked. I think what he's doing is he's using Dante as a thematic backdrop. And so this is a conversation with Dante, or it's an inspiration from Dante, but it's not just a modern take on Dante. All right, so some other literary connections here. And I'm combining a couple ideas together here with this title, Sir Ransom in Wonderland. And so we get some Arthurian themes here. And so we see that a woman gives Ransom a quest to save an innocent and a vulnerable soul. And then with unflinching courage, Ransom accepts the quest and sets off for a dark wood. And we're given this idea here that Ransom didn't even consider this request to go and save her son. It's something that he just did with reflexive courage. And so we see here the same kind of thing we see in Mallory's tale of the Knights of King Arthur, where they receive these quests and they just go off and do them because that's what knights do. And then, he goes into a dark wood, which very often is where the real quest begins. This is when the brave knights will encounter something fantastical, which sometimes kind of unnerves them. And this is when we get a sense of what their real quest is, and they have to do some fantastical feat in order to save the day, to fulfill the quest that they initially set out on. And I mean, in classic tales, the wood almost always stands for chaos, for the unknown, for that which is beyond the borders of civilization, for uncharted territory. And so this is where you never know what's going to happen. And this is very much what we see happen with Ransom. This is when he enters into this fantastical reality and he starts to get sent on his real quest. And then, just a little side note here, we're told that Weston and Devine are currently residing in a house previously occupied by someone named Alice. I can't help but to think that this is intentional, that this is a Wonderland reference, that this is where Ransom is going to find his rabbit hole, where he's going to enter into this fantastical, this strange reality, and where he's going to lose his footing before he gains it again. Next, and I don't have a whole lot to say about this, but I think it's worth paying attention to some of this language here. This is shortly after Ransom has encountered Devine and Weston, and we see the following. "Who are you?" bawled the thick man. "My name is Ransom, if that is what you mean, and—" "By Jove," said the slender man. "Not Ransom, he used to be at Wedenshaw." We really need to focus on this "by Jove" here. On one hand, yeah, that's a common British expression, but Lewis chooses his words very carefully. And perhaps you may remember that Jove is another name for Jupiter, the king of the planets who orders the heavens. And so what we see here is, regardless of what was actually meant in the story, we see that ultimately it is by Jove that Ransom is here. It is by Jove that Ransom is being led into danger, ultimately because this is what's going to bring about the most good for Ransom as well as for the earth and maybe even the heavens. And so Jove is ultimately responsible, despite the fact that Ransom seems to be falling into chaos. And so there is order even when chaos seems to be reigning. And eventually this is something that Ransom will come to appreciate more and to understand more than he does in this moment. And so whenever you see an expression like that, like "by Jove," or, if hell is used, even as an obscenity, it's used purposeful. It's used to communicate something, to evoke a mood, to signal something to the reader. All right, next let's talk a little bit about Devine and Weston. Now, first, just looking at their names, we see that they are corruptions, right? Devine is surely a corruption of the divine, and Weston is a corruption of the West, of the ideals of the West, of progress, of reason, of transcendence. And I don't think it's unreasonable to draw a connection here to the Akalabeth, that is the fall of Numenor. Numenor being, of course, Tolkien's Atlantis story. Numenor being described as the true West. This is the westernmost place of men who live closest to the realm of the Valar, the Undying Lands. And if you don't know your Tolkienian history, in the first age of Middle-earth, Morgoth, who is really kind of a Satan figure, the big bad of the first age, he gets defeated as the Valar finally come into play and wage war against Morgoth and his forces, and the men who sided with the Valar in their fight against Morgoth are rewarded with the island of Numenor, and they're rewarded with long lives as well. Well, eventually, these privileges that they have start to become their downfall, as instead of having gratitude for the gift they've been given, for the longevity of their lives, they instead start to lust after what is even better, and that, of course, is immortality. And so this begins as they start to form really this kind of death cult, where they really pour resources, pour focus, pour energy into embalming, toward these great tombs, as a way of sort of imitating life through their practices surrounding death. Well, eventually even that is not enough, and so with the encouragement of Sauron, they eventually wage war on the Valar. They seek to take the Undying Lands by force, but that doesn't go well for them. They never actually make it to the shore of the Undying Land before their fleet and their entire island is sunk to the bottom of the sea. So in their pursuit of transcendence, they actually end up plummeting downward to the depths of the sea. And so those who most grasp at progress, who most grasp at transcendence, those who worship their reason, ultimately become consumed by it. And so their pursuit of transcendence ultimately leads to their downfall. If you're familiar with Paradise Lost, this is ultimately what happened to Satan. He started to worship his own reason, and that's what led to his fall, both spiritually, existentially, as well as cosmically. And like I said, I don't think it's at all a stretch to connect Weston to the true West of Numenor, seeing as Numenor itself is actually going to be mentioned later in the series as the true West. And so it's not at all a stretch to see that play out here. Now, another connection here to the fact that Devine and Weston are trying to reach upward, but in so doing are actually reaching downward, they say to each other, "We ought to have a dog in this place," said Weston to his companion, ignoring Ransom. "You mean we should have a dog, if you hadn't insist on using tartar for an experiment," said the man who had not yet spoken. And so we see that Weston and Devine, as part of their pursuit of transcendence, were experimenting on a dog named Tartar, surely a connection to Tartarus. And so they're playing with forces of hell even as they're trying to reach for the heavens. So next I want to talk about this weird dream that Ransom had. So after Ransom gets drugged, he has this dream, which reads something like a vision. And so Weston, Devine, and Ransom are in this walled garden, and they can't get through the door, and so Weston and Devine climb over it, but then they're pulled back through the door, back into the garden, while Ransom is stuck on top of the wall, sort of straddling the edge between the darkness and the light, the known and the unknown, the garden and whatever it is that's outside. I'm told that Ransom found it impossible to get down from the wall. He remained sitting, not frightened, but rather uncomfortable because his right leg, which was on the outside, felt so dark, and his left leg felt so light. "My leg will drop off if it gets much darker," he said. Then he looked down into the darkness and asked, "Who are you?" And the queer people must still have been there, for they all replied, "Hoo, hoo, hoo," just like owls. Alright, so this is kind of weird. In all the commentaries and analyses that I looked at here, a lot of them said, we don't fully understand what's happening here. And I actually appreciate that because it really makes this feel more like a dream than simply a literary tool, right? Because dreams very often have this range, this collection of symbols that all doesn't always make sense as a coherent essay might. And so what we have here are some themes, some pictures that are communicating something, but it's not super clear. And so let's talk about a little bit about what seems to be happening here. Well, for one thing, we see that Weston and Devine are trying to get somewhere that they're not invited to. We get the sense that they're breaking into something, or I guess breaking out of something through some unjust means, and that, in the end, they're pulled back into the garden where they began. And so they never successfully become engaged with whatever this world is that's beyond. We get the sense that it's closed off to them. Whatever this outside reality is, it is closed off to them. They are not permitted, no matter how much they try to contrive a pathway, they are not permitted to leave. And so I think what this shows us is that, even when they successfully make it out to the heavens, when they start to visit this other planet, they're still living as citizens of the silent planet. They never get enlarged perspectives. And so they are continually closed off from the heavens, from true reality. Ransom, however, he serves as a bridge. He's not thrown back into the garden, nor is he fully on the outside of the garden. He is a bridge. He is a connection. He is a halfway point. He is the union between the earth and the heavens. And so he plays this mediator role. He plays this priestly role. And I think this is a theme, an important theme, that we're going to see developed throughout the Ransom series. If you've read Malacandra already, think of when he's referred to as piebald, right? He's half dark and he's half light. I think that's a continuation of this same theme that we see here. The idea that Ransom has a foot in both worlds. He is going to be a bridge. He's going to be a union between heaven and earth. Well, a short while later, Ransom finds himself finally in space, and he encounters this with absolute terror. As he comes to this realization, he says, "You mean we're in space?" Ransom uttered the word with difficulty, as a frightened child speaks of ghosts, or a frightened man of cancer. And this is something that Lewis talks about in some of his essays, that there are really two kinds of fears. So on one hand, you could be afraid of something that poses some obvious danger to you, right? Right. There's a lion in the room next to you. That instills a certain kind of obvious physical terror. But there's also the kind of terror that comes from not what something would do to you, but simply the fact that something is. That something threatens your existence in a pretty fundamental way, that something serves to just unnerve you. And so that's the kind of terror that we have here. It is the terror of space. And this is such an important passage that I think it's worth me just taking the time to read it and for us to just kind of reflect on it, to dwell on it. This was one of the most influential passages on me out of the entire story. And so here we go. But Ransom, as time wore on, became aware of another and more spiritual cause for his progressive lightening and exaltation of heart. A nightmare, long engendered in the modern mind by the mythology that follows the wake of science, was falling off him. He had read of space. At the back of his thinking for years had lurked the dismal fancy of the black, cold vacuity, the utter deadness, which was supposed to separate the worlds. He had not known how much it affected him till now that the very name space seemed a blasphemous libel for the empyrean ocean of radiance in which they swam. He could not call it dead. He felt life pouring into him from it every moment. How indeed could it be otherwise, since out of this ocean the worlds and all their life had come? He had thought it barren. He saw now that it was the womb of worlds, whose blazing and innumerable offspring looked down nightly even upon the earth with so many eyes. And here, how many more? No, space was the wrong name. Older thinkers had been wiser when they named it simply the heavens which declared the glory, the happy climes that lie where day never shuts his eye, up in the broad fields of the sky. He quoted Milton's word to himself lovingly, at this time and often. Christina Hale reflects on this, saying, "To think of the heavens as the great outer darkness, as our modern minds often do, is to replace heaven with hell. Thinking this way restructures the imaginative layout of the cosmos and changes the way we look up at the night sky. It rejects the view of thousands of years of prophets and poets in favor of listening to science, without entertaining the idea that perhaps there are realities that are deeper than the material, and that we are not yet real enough to see them." I like this a lot. I think it gets it fundamentally right, that we have replaced heaven with hell. You go back to the old world, and they talk about the heavens teeming with life, with purpose, with significance, with angelic choirs. Whereas now we look beyond the Earth's atmosphere, and what we see is space. We see the outer darkness. What we see is hell. And that's not inconsequential, but I think that this is necessarily what happens when we let science play philosophy, something that it was never meant to do. I'm not against science, and Lewis is not against science. What he is against is mistaking science for philosophy. Science does is it examines material realities. It helps us to understand material realities. But material realities don't tell us anything about purpose. It doesn't tell us anything about metaphysical realities. It doesn't tell us anything about telos, about goals, or about how we should live. It doesn't tell us anything about what to do with these material realities. And so we're doing something wrong when we say that the way to understand reality is to do science, because, well, reality itself is a metaphysical structure of reality. We're putting things together in a meaningful, coherent way that science doesn't actually have anything to do with. And so science is a tool. Science is not philosophy. And when we let science play philosophy, what we get is hell. And that's something that we're going to see throughout this series in very vivid terms. And I think it's worth throwing in here this quote from the Don Treader. And we'll talk about more of this when we actually get there in our study, but let's just look at it now. "In our world," said Eustace, "a star is a huge ball of flaming gas. Even in your world, my son, that is not what a star is, but only what it is made of." And here I think we get a pretty strong rebuke of our misunderstanding of what science is and what science is able to accomplish. All right, next the crew starts to land on Malacandra, and this process is very unnerving, it's very unsettling. We get the sense that they are falling out of heaven. It says, "Now with a certainty which never after deserted him, he saw the planets, the earth he called them in his thought, as mere holes or gaps in the living heaven, excluded and rejected wastes of heavy matter and murky air, formed not by addition to, but by subtraction from the surrounding brightness." And so this is not a fallen planet like Earth. This is, at least mostly, a good planet. However, even a good planet is not the heavens. And so we get the sense that even though he's in a place now that's better than Earth, he's still moving away from reality. Remember that within the Platonic scheme, reality is a spectrum where some things are more real than others, and that which is most real is the good. And so there's a certain sense in which the heavens come before the planets, both historically as well as ontologically, in their nature, in their being. They are in many ways more important. And so as he moves toward the heavens, he gets this levity. He gets this sense that he's moving toward that which is more real. As he moves down to the planet, out of the heavens, he's still somewhere good, but it's the direction of his movement that matters. He's moving away from that which is best. And so that's why this is such a rough landing. And then, and I love this, he says, "And yet, he thought, beyond the solar system, the brightness ends. Is that the real void? The real death? Unless..." he groped for the idea, unless visible light is also a hole or gap, a mere diminution of something else, something that is to bright, unchanging heaven, as heaven is to the dark, heavy earths. And so he's just reflecting on what I'm just talking about, the idea that reality is a spectrum. And so he thinks of, okay, light is more real than darkness. And so perhaps it is beyond this realm of physical light where we finally get what we call space, where we finally get emptiness. That is the real void, the real death. However, then it dawns on him that, wait, what if even though at that point we're beyond the realm of physical light, there actually is not nothing, but there's actually something even more of a something, that there's something even more real, that as earth is to the heavens, perhaps the physical heavens are to something else, something more real, something greater, right? Something that we don't have the means of dealing with. And remember what I said before about how, biblically speaking, sometimes God is portrayed as living in unapproachable light, other times as living in impenetrable darkness. And I think that's something of what he's getting at here, that whatever is most real makes reality as we know it seem like unreality. And so then we get what I think is pretty profound Christian Platonic meditation taking place here. Now he finally gets his way out of the spaceship and gets his first sights of the planet. And we're told that he saw nothing but colors, colors that refused to form themselves into things. Moreover, he knew nothing yet well enough to see it. You cannot see things till you know roughly what they are. Now, remember, for Lewis and for Plato and the Platonic tradition, the form of something is more real than the particular. And so you can't really know what a just action is unless you first know what justice is. And so you need to understand the form before you can understand the particular. I think that's what we see playing out here. Now, a few more first impressions of the planet here. We're told that he sees all this vegetation that's really upward focused, that because of the way that gravity works here, all the planets are very thin, very spindly, and they're all pointing upward. And so we get this strong directional orientation to the plant life. And I think this is getting at a few things here. First of all, we see this Mars Sylvanus theme, that Mars, although the martial spirit and the god of war, is also a god of vegetation. And so we get this springtime, this idea of life, this idea of a upward movement. And I actually don't even remember which book I read this in, but there's this discussion in one of the texts about how a lot of Ransom's experience on this planet is arranged in a very vertical direction. And so we have plant life is rising up. You've got the inhabitants of the planet occupy three distinct geographical parts of the planet. And so you've got the Fifiltrigi at the bottom, kind of in the caverns in the valley. You've got the Harassa living in the middle. And then you've got the Sorens living on the higher level. And even Ransom's journey, he begins on the level of the Harassa, then he moves up to where the Sorens live, and then finally he makes his way up to Meldalorn. And so we get this up and down pattern. And one of the texts brought up the fact that perhaps this is even some kind of phallic imagery. I don't want to get too weird with this, but Mars is a masculine planet, and in light of some of the things that Lewis has said elsewhere, I don't think this is beyond the pale. Okay, next, one of the first things that happen is after they start to encounter the Sorn, then the hnau shows up, and so we get a physical altercation taking place, which I think very much speaks to the militant mood of this planet. And Ransom, he runs away, and eventually he encounters the Harassa. And I just love this scene here where he first encounters the Harassa. I'm not going to read all of this, but he doesn't really know what this creature is, but he starts to recognize that it's trying to speak with him, that has some kind of intelligible language. And so on one hand, he's afraid for his life. He doesn't really know what's going to happen. But at the same time, he's kind of daydreaming about writing a Malacandrian grammar book, which I think is kind of amusing. But also it speaks to the fact that Ransom is starting to be transformed. Remember, just a short while ago, he saw the idea of space itself as terrifying. But he's overcome that, and now he's overcoming his Wellesian fear of the unknown, intelligent extraterrestrial, and he's starting to treat this as being kind of normal. And so we get the sense that the Malacandrian air is doing something to him, just as the air of Narnia does something to ennoble and to transform the children who visit there. So he spends some time with the Rasa. There are some, I think, significant philosophical conversations that happen there, but we'll talk about that probably during the live meetings, maybe on the Discord. But eventually we get to the hnau hunt, which very much speaks to the martial spirit of this planet and of their Oyarsa. So Hoy says, I long to kill this hnau, as he also longs to kill me. I hope that my ship will be the first, and I first in my ship with my straight spear when the black jaws snap. And if he kills me, my people will mourn, and my brothers will desire still more to kill him. But they will not wish that there were no hnau, nor do I. And so what we see here is that this is an unfallen planet, yet there is violence. What we see is that violence is not necessarily sinful. I mean, I guess at least on this planet, that there is an ennobled way that conflict can take place, and perhaps especially in the pagan past, which I think is largely what we're seeing here on Malacandra. And we'll talk about that a bit more when we get to some of the conversations in Perelandra. I think about the fact that some of the Psalms and elsewhere talks about how God provides for the lions. And of course, how does he do that? By giving them prey. And so we get this sense here that not all conflict is bad. We get a bit more in this next section from Hoy, as he says, I will tell you a day in my life that has shaped me. Such a day as comes only once, like love, or serving Oyarsa in Meldalorn. Then I was young, not much more than a cub when I went far, far up the Hundramit to the land where stars shine at midday and even water is cold. A great waterfall I climbed. I stood on the shore of Balki the pool, which is the place of most awe in all worlds. The walls of it go up forever and ever, and huge and holy images are cut in them, the work of old times. There is the fall called the Mountain of Water. Because I have stood there alone, Maleldil nigh, for even Oyarsa sent me no word. My heart has been higher, my song deeper, all my days. But do you think it would have been so, unless I had known that in that Balki Hnau dwelled? There I drank life, because death was in the pool. That was the best of drinks, save one. What one? Asked Ransom. Death itself, in the day I drink it, and go to Maleldil. And so here, again, we get the sense that there is life to be found even in death, that there's something about this fight. There's something about the reality of death, whether it be that of the hnau or of the Hras, that is good if it's embraced in the right way. And so it's all about channeling the martial spirit to do what is good and what is noble. And this is a very important lesson that Ransom is going to have to learn, and that's going to come up in very clear terms when we get to Perelandra. And if you've already read that story, then you know what that might look like. And so what we see is Ransom starting to develop a positive relationship with the martial influence. And then, of course, we get to the actual hunt. We're told, something long sleeping in the blood awoke in Ransom. It did not seem impossible at this moment that even he might be the hnau slayer, that the fame of Human Hnaukraput might be handed down to posterity in this world that knew no other man. And so, again, we get this idea that the heir of Mars is doing something in Ransom, that it's ennobling him, that is causing him to undergo this transformation, to become more like the ruler of the planet, just as we see with the children in Narnia, as they become ennobled and more Aslan-like through the heir of Narnia. And then, of course, after the hunt, Hoy is shot and dies, and then Ransom finally begins to answer the summons of Maleldil, and this is where he encounters Augre the Sorn. And I'm not going to read through all this right now, but he starts to talk about the Eldila, about these beings that are just kind of on the edge of Ransom's perception. They're obviously some kind of angelic, or at least semi-angelic beings that are doing the will of Oyarsa, but Ransom really doesn't have a firm category for understanding what they are. And Augre starts to describe them as being these agents that kind of appear as light, but in reality there's something more real. And I think this is tied to what Ransom was meditating on before, about something being even more brilliant than light itself. And there's this wonder about, okay, are the Eldila around on Earth, and maybe Ransom has just never perceived them? He's not really sure. But Augre says it's kind of weird that the Eldila don't seem to be on Earth. And then Ransom, or thinking this through, says, of that I am not certain. It had dawned on him that the recurrent human tradition of bright, elusive people, sometimes appearing on the Earth, Alves, Devas, and the like, might, after all, have another explanation than the anthropologist had yet given. True, it would turn the universe rather oddly inside out, but his experiences in the spaceship had prepared him for such operation. And so basically, it kind of starts to conclude here that maybe these stories about fairies that we have are actually onto something. Maybe they're speaking to something real. However, this wouldn't only turn everything inside out because of some of these meditations he's having on kind of what reality really is and about kind of analogies of light and existence and all that. That's kind of mind-blowing in itself, but it also turns things inside out by giving a quasi-physical explanation of what we think of as being these fantastical, illusory realities. And so this is a continuation of this breakdown between the mundane and the fantastical. Now, next, before he leaves Augury's cave, he is able to use this telescope-like instrument in order to look on Earth. And Ransom realizes it was all there in that little disc. London, Athens, Jerusalem, Shakespeare, there everyone had lived, and everything had happened. And there, presumably, his pack was still lying in the porch of an empty house near Stirk. Yes, he said dully to Lesorn, that is my world. It was the bleakest moment in all of his travels. Now, why is this the bleakest moment? On one hand, he's looking at home. You would think that might be kind of enlivening to him. But it's so bleak in that he begins to recognize that this world that holds all, or I guess at least nearly, all of human history is so small. It is limited. It is not the full story. And that has a kind of disquieting feel to it, to know that things might not be quite as significant as we once thought. But of course, through this whole journey, he's going to recognize that the Earth actually has far more significance than he realized. And this reminds me of Mere Christianity, where Lewis writes, "Nothing in you that has not died will ever be raised from the dead. Look for yourself, and you will find in the long run only hatred, loneliness, despair, rage, ruin, and decay. But look for Christ, and you will find him, and with him everything else thrown in." And so this is a fairly common theme in Lewis's writing, the idea that you have to give yourself away in order to find yourself, that becoming an authentic individual is about engaging authentically with love. And what love does, what real love does, is it causes us to open ourselves up, to become more expansive, to give ourselves over toward that which is lovely. And in so doing, we ourselves become lovely. But before you get there, you have to fall into this self-denial. You have to enter into a kind of death before you can enter into life. Keep that in mind, especially as we get to Perelandra. Right, now, eventually he makes his way to the court of Oyarsa. And again, I'm not going to read all of this, but Oyarsa kind of reveals this cosmic history. It seems pretty clear to us if you have any kind of Christian understanding of cosmic history. Okay, the Oyarsa of Mars is some kind of angel, some kind of angelic-like reality, and this fits in nicely with Lewis's medievalism. Remember when I talked about the significance of the angels and how some angels are responsible for moving the planets, and so Oyarsa fits nicely within this medieval model. But ultimately, Oyarsa is more of a class or a title, and so he's talking to the Oyarsa of Mars. There's also an Oyarsa of Earth, the bent one who turned away from the fellowship that all these Oyarsu have with each other, and that's why we have a silent planet, because the Oyarsa of our planet is really confined to this location. And so really what Earth is something like the prison of the bent one, and we tend to take on that influence that is pressed onto us at every turn. And then to really drive in what's going on here, Oyarsa talks about how Maleldil, which surely is Christ, wrestled with the bent one on Earth, but Oyarsa doesn't really know much about this, and it is a thing that we desire to look into. And this is pulling straight from Scripture, the fact that angels desire to look into the realities of the gospel. And Lewis really gives us a pretty strong indicator of what it is that we're talking about, just in case we missed it. Oyarsa talks about how Ransom has been so afraid, and Ransom confesses, "That is true, Oyarsa. Bent creatures are full of fears. But I'm here now and ready to know your will with me." And so really we see the fruit of this conversion that Ransom has experienced. And so he recognizes bent creatures are full of fears. And so those who are ungrounded in reality, well, they don't have any ground to stand on. They don't have any foundation. They're insecure. They're latching themselves onto moving fortunes instead of grounding themselves in the goodness of reality itself. And so bent creatures are full of fears. They're full of anxieties. but now he is here securely, ready to know what it is that Oyarsa wants with him. And Oyarsa says that there are 2 things that I wanted to ask of your race. First, I must know why you come here. So much is my duty to my world. And secondly, I wish to hear of Malacandra and of Malelda's strange wars there with the Bent One. For that, as I have said, is a thing we desire to look into. So again, we get this biblical language repeated, that Oyarsa longs to know more about this gospel story that's taken place on Earth. And then again, I'm not going to read this whole passage, but I do just think it's very interesting and kind of amusing when Weston and Devine are pulled into the court. At first, Ransom doesn't recognize them. They seem strange. They're like misshapen creatures, and eventually he realizes what they are. And so we really get the sense that he's seeing, as it says here, almost with Malacandrian eyes. And so he's really become immersed in this world. He's really learned to get outside of his earthly perspective. He's become more expansive in his perspective, more expansive in his vision. And remember, I talked about how real love, that the right kind of love, right, the right kind of philosophy, which is the love of wisdom, causes us to become more expansive, to give ourselves over to greater and greater realities, and then greater realities tend to return the favor, making us more real. I think that's what's happening in this scene. And I love the scene where Ransom's providing a translation of Weston to Oyarsa. It's a way of really demonstrating the sophistry, the empty rhetoric, the absurdity of Weston's arguments, despite the fact that he uses very grandiose language here. And so, Weston says, "To you it may seem a vulgar robber, but I bear on my shoulders the destiny of the human race. Your tribal life, with its Stone Age weapons and beehive huts, its primitive coracles and elementary social structures, has nothing to compare with our civilization, with our science, medicine, and law, our armies, our architecture, our commerce, and our transport system, which is rapidly annihilating space and time. Our right to supersede you is the right of the higher over the lower." And then Ransom translates this by saying, "Among us, Oyarsa, there's a kind of hnau who will take other hnau's food and things when they are not looking. He says he is not an ordinary one of that kind. So in other words, he absolutely is a robber, but, not an ordinary one, as if that's somehow ennobling." And then I think that whole back and forth is just worth going over a few times, but let's keep going. So Oyarsa gives this rebuke to Weston. He says, "Strange," said Oyarsa, "you do not love any one of your race. You would have let me kill Ransom. You do not love the mind of your race, nor the body. Any kind of creature will please you, if only it is begotten by your kin as they now are. It seems to me, Thick One, that what you really love is no completed creature, but the very seed itself, for that is all that is left." And so Oyarsa recognizes that Weston talks about how he's serving the advancement of humanity, that he has a great love for humanity, yet we've seen that he actually has no love for any particular humans. He mistreats people for his scientific experiments. He was more than willing to sacrifice Ransom when he thought Oyarsa was going to consume him or something. And so he doesn't actually care for any individual people, any individual humans, despite the fact that he claims to have this great love for humanity. And so Oyarsa demonstrates this absurdity that beneath all of his speech is really this diabolical absurdity. But of course, Weston is not willing to engage in this kind of authentic conversation. And so he says, "Tell him," said Weston, when he had been made to understand this, "that I don't pretend to be a metaphysician. I have not come here to chop logic. If he cannot understand, as apparently you can't either, anything so fundamental as a man's loyalty to humanity, I can't make him understand it." And here, Lewis is very clearly rebuking the science-philosophy complex, right, where people make all these claims in the name of science, but then you start to actually question them on philosophical terms and make them move toward more of a coherent framework. Well, now suddenly they just back up and, refuse to engage in philosophy. I think of Stephen Hawking saying that philosophy is dead because it's been superseded by science, despite the fact that that itself is a philosophical claim. And as if we were missing the point, in the conclusion, when Ransom finally makes it back to Earth, and now we get this postscript, we're told that we have also evidence, increasing almost daily, that Weston, or the force or forces behind Weston, will play a very important part in the events of the next few centuries, and unless we prevent them, a very disastrous one. We do not mean that they are likely to invade Mars. Our cry is not merely, hands off Malacandra. The dangers to be feared are not planetary, but cosmic, or at least solar, and they are not temporal, but eternal. And so, in case we missed it, Lewis comes right out and basically says that this stuff is real. The threat that Weston poses is a real threat that we have to deal with, that we must deal with, that we will inescapably deal with, or at least it will deal with us if nothing else. And of course, what this force or forces behind Weston are will become more evident in the next story. Now, in the final bit of the postscript, Lewis says, "Now that Weston has shut the door, the way to the planets lies through the past. If there is to be any more space traveling, it will have to be time traveling as well." Now, this is likely connected to the origin story for this series, which I probably should have talked about earlier on. But in any case, Lewis and Tolkien were talking about how there weren't enough stories that they wanted to read being written, and so they were going to do it themselves. And they decided that they wanted a space travel story and a time travel story. And so they flipped a coin. Lewis got space, Tolkien got time. Now, as often happened, Tolkien's literary commitment never actually came to fruition. I mean, it eventually became The Lost Road, which was not published in its own right, but did serve an important role in the formation of Tolkien's legendarium. But nonetheless, I think that Lewis here is really trying to set up Tolkien's work that really just never came to be. However, Lewis himself, in his first attempt at a sequel to Out of the Silent Planet, did indeed write a time travel story, and this is known as The Dark Tower. Now, this is an incomplete manuscript. Likely it was never finished, or perhaps we lost some of it. Not really sure entirely. But regardless, we have a good portion of this story, and I would recommend picking it up. You can get the book, The Dark Tower, and other stories. And so this contains what we have from The Dark Tower, this first attempt at a sequel to Out of the Silent Planet, which really does focus on time travel. It's kind of weird, it's very dark, but I still think it's worth reading. Maybe once you've finished the Ransom series, at least one time around, it's worth going back to this. Now, it is kind of frustrating in that it is interesting, it is fascinating, it is gripping. However, it does cut off pretty abruptly, and so that just kind of is what it is. But nonetheless, it's worth reading, as well as the other short stories that we do have in completion that are included in this collection here. And so it's worth checking out. Maybe we can talk about The Dark Tower a little bit if that's something that you're interested in. But that concludes this current discussion of Out of the Silent Planet. I hope that this was useful for you. If you have any questions about anything that I discussed, or simply anything in this story or about the story, please let me know. The best way to do that would be to chime in on the Discord channel, as well as to bring it to our live conversations. But of course, if you let me know about something that you're wondering about ahead of time, then I'll be able to look into it a little bit and give more of an informed response in the live conversation. But that's it for now, and so let's go ahead and start traveling further up and further in with Perelandra. Thank you for listening, and thank you to all patrons who make this possible. And by name, I'd like to thank all Tier 3 patrons and higher. So many thank yous to Mark, Aaron, Amanda, Andrew, Chase, Chaz, Christopher, Clinton, David, Don, Aaron, Evie, Adam, Jack, Jamie, Justin, Kyle, Paul, Roger, Ross, Tyler, and William. All of you, as well as my Tier 1 and 2 patrons, you're what funds Mythic Mind. You're what allows us to continue doing the things that we're doing and continue to ramp up speed, ramp up production, and to branch out in new directions. And so if you want to become part of that, become an insider, join our Discord chats, become an active member in the various things that we're doing, head over to patreon.com/mythicmind. Any level of support helps and brings you on the inside. And as a reminder, if you purchase an annual Tier 3 patronage or higher, then you also get access to all of my courses that begin within that term, which at this point includes Plato's Stoicism, Until We Have Faces, the Elder Scrolls and Philosophy, and the Silmarillion. So I hope to see you around the fellowship, but no matter what, I hope that you continue listening to the podcast, and you will hear from us next on Friday with the Mythic Mind Games podcast on The Legend of Zelda. But until then, Godspeed.